Jake never thought his life would fall apart so quickly. Just 6 months ago he had a steady job, a nice apartment, and enough money in his bank account to feel secure. But then the company he worked for suddenly closed down, leaving hundreds of employees without jobs and without warning. At first, Jake was optimistic. He had good experience and solid references. Finding another job should be easy, he thought. But weeks turned into months, and every interview led to the same result. "We'll call you back." The calls never came. His savings disappeared faster than he expected. First he had to choose between groceries and his car payment. Then he started selling his belongings just to pay rent. The furniture he had bought with his first paycheck was gone. His laptop, his watch, even his father's old guitar that he promised never to sell. The eviction notice came on a Tuesday morning. Jake stared at the yellow paper taped to his door, feeling his heart sink into his stomach. He had exactly 30 days to find 3 months' worth of rent, or he would be living on the streets. At 32 years old, he had never felt so helpless. That afternoon, Jake sat in a coffee shop downtown, trying to make a single cup of coffee last as long as possible. He couldn't afford to buy another one, but he needed somewhere warm to sit while he searched for jobs on his phone. The Wi-Fi was free, and the staff hadn't asked him to leave yet. He was scrolling through job listings when a woman approached his table. She was probably in her 40s, dressed in clothes that clearly cost more than Jake made in a month when he actually had a job. Her shoes alone looked like they could pay his rent. "Excuse me," she said with a smile that seemed both friendly and calculating. "Are you Jake Thompson?" Jake looked up, confused. He didn't recognize her at all. She was tall, with perfectly styled hair and makeup that looked professional. Everything about her screamed money and power. "Yes, that's me," he replied carefully. "Do we know each other?" The woman extended her hand. "I'm Catherine Wells. I've been looking for you." Jake shook her hand, still confused. "Looking for me? What?" Catherine gestured to the empty chair across from him. "May I sit? I think we need to talk about your situation." Something in her tone made Jake nervous, but he nodded. Catherine sat down and placed an expensive-looking leather folder on the table between them. "I know you're having some financial difficulties," she began. "I also know about the issue with your former employer." "What issue?" Jake asked, though his stomach was already churning with worry. Catherine opened the folder and pulled out several official-looking documents. "When your company closed, they had some outstanding debts. Unfortunately, some of those debts were transferred to certain employees under a clause in your employment contract." Jake felt the blood drain from his face. "What are you talking about? I never signed anything like that." "I'm afraid you did," Catherine said, sliding one of the documents across the table. "It's in the fine print of your original employment agreement. Most people never read it carefully." Jake grabbed the paper and tried to read it, but the legal language was confusing and full of words he didn't understand. The numbers at the bottom, however, were crystal clear. He apparently owed someone $47,000. "This can't be right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't have this kind of money. I can't even pay my rent." Catherine leaned back in her chair, studying him carefully. "I know. That's exactly why I'm here. I don't understand. I own the company that now holds your debt," Catherine explained. "I could pursue legal action, garnish any future wages you might earn, and basically make sure you never recover financially, or ... She paused dramatically. "We could work out an arrangement." Jake looked up from the papers, hope and fear fighting in his chest. "What kind of arrangement?" "I need someone I can trust for some personal assistance," Catherine said. "Someone reliable, discreet, and motivated to do good work. In exchange for your services, I would be willing to forgive your debt entirely." It sounded too good to be true, which immediately made Jake suspicious. "What kind of personal assistance?" "Nothing complicated," Catherine assured him. "Administrative work, running errands, helping with events, that sort of thing. The pay would be generous enough for you to get back on your feet, and once you've completed your term of service, the debt disappears forever." Jake stared at the documents again. $47,000. It might as well have been $1 million. Even if he found a good job tomorrow, it would take him years to pay off that kind of money. Assuming Catherine's company didn't charge interest, how long would this arrangement last? He asked. "That depends on how well you perform your duties," Catherine replied. "I'd estimate anywhere from 6 months to a year, maybe less if you prove particularly capable." Jake felt trapped. On one hand, this woman was essentially offering him a way out of an impossible situation. On the other hand, something about her manner made him uncomfortable. The way she smiled never seemed to reach her eyes. The way she spoke about his debt as if it was definitely real, even though he had no memory of agreeing to anything like that. Can I think about it? He asked. Catherine's smile became a little sharper. Of course. But I should mention that I have lawyers who are very good at collecting debts. If you choose not to accept my offer, they'll begin proceedings immediately. You'll receive the first legal notice within a week. The threat was clear, even though she delivered it in the same pleasant tone she'd been using all along. Jake realized he didn't really have a choice. He could accept her mysterious job offer, or he could spend the next several years fighting a legal battle he couldn't afford to fight. What would I need to do exactly? He asked, already knowing he was going to say yes. Catherine pulled out another document from her folder. Just sign this agreement. It outlines your responsibilities and compensation. Everything is very straightforward. Jake read through the contract as carefully as he could, but like the debt document, it was full of legal language that was hard to understand. The basics seemed simple enough. He would be available when Catherine needed him. He would complete tasks as assigned, and he would maintain complete confidentiality about all aspects of his work. The salary listed was more than he had made at his previous job, enough to not just survive, but to actually live comfortably. After months of choosing between food and bills, the number seemed almost unreal. There's one more thing, Catherine said, as Jake read. This arrangement requires absolute discretion. You cannot discuss the details of your work with anyone, not friends, not family, not future employers. Do you understand? Jake nodded, though the requirement made him even more nervous. What kind of work required that level of secrecy? Catherine produced an expensive pen from her purse and placed it on the table next to the contract. If you're ready to begin, I need your signature. Jake picked up the pen, his hand shaking slightly. Every instinct told him this was a mistake, but what choice did he have? He was about to be homeless. He had no job prospects, and apparently, he owed a debt that could ruin him financially for years. He signed his name at the bottom of the contract. Catherine's smile widened as she collected the papers. Excellent. Welcome to your new position, Jake. I think this is going to be a very interesting working relationship. As she gathered her things and prepared to leave, Catherine handed him a business card with just a phone number on it. I'll call you tomorrow with your first assignment. Make sure you answer when I call. Jake watched her walk away, noting how everyone in the coffee shop seemed to step aside for her without even thinking about it. She had the kind of presence that commanded attention and respect, or maybe fear. Sitting alone at his table, Jake looked at the business card in his hands, and wondered what he had just gotten himself into. The rational part of his mind knew he should have asked more questions, should have demanded to see proof of the debt, should have insisted on having a lawyer review the contract. But the desperate part of his mind, the part that was tired of being hungry and scared and humiliated, was just grateful that someone had offered him a solution, even if that solution came with strings attached that he didn't fully understand yet. Jake finished his cold coffee and walked home to his nearly empty apartment, trying to convince himself that he had made the right choice. Tomorrow, he would start his new job and begin working his way out of the hole his life had become. He had no idea that he was actually digging himself deeper into a different kind of hole entirely. The first week working for Catherine felt like a dream come true. Jake couldn't believe how normal everything seemed after all his worrying. She had him organize her office, schedule appointments, and handle her correspondence. It was basic administrative work that he could do with his eyes closed. The pay was even better than promised. When Jake saw his first paycheck, he actually had to sit down for a moment. It was more money than he had seen in months. He immediately paid his rent, bought groceries without checking prices, and even treated himself to a decent meal at a restaurant for the first time since losing his job. Catherine's penthouse office was located in one of the most expensive buildings downtown. The view from the 42nd floor was incredible, and Jake found himself working in luxury he had never experienced before. The furniture was elegant, the technology was cutting edge, and everything seemed designed to impress. But by the second week, Jake started noticing things that made him uncomfortable. Catherine would often stand very close to him when giving instructions, closer than seemed necessary for a professional relationship. She had a way of touching his shoulder or arm when she spoke that felt too personal. The work hours also began to change. What started as a normal 9-to-5 schedule gradually expanded. Catherine would call him at 7 in the evening and ask him to come in for an urgent project. Then it became 8 o'clock calls, then 9 o'clock calls. I need you to stay late tonight, Catherine announced one Friday afternoon. I have some important documents that need to be prepared for a meeting tomorrow morning. Jake looked at his watch. It was already past 5, and he had plans to meet a friend for dinner. But something in Catherine's tone made it clear that saying no wasn't really an option. Of course, he replied, cancelling his plans with a quick text message. As the weeks passed, Jake realized that Catherine's definition of personal assistance was much broader than he had originally understood. She had him accompany her to business dinners, standing quietly in the corner while she negotiated deals with people who clearly had more money than most countries. At these events, Catherine would introduce him differently depending on who she was talking to. Sometimes he was her assistant, other times she would call him her associate, and occasionally she would just smile mysteriously and say he was helping her with some special projects. The other people at these gatherings looked at Jake with curiosity and sometimes pity. He could tell they were wondering what exactly his role was and why someone like Catherine would need someone like him around so often. One evening, Catherine asked him to attend a party at her private residence. "It's a networking event," she explained. "I need someone there who can help me remember names and details about the guests." The party was unlike anything Jake had ever experienced. The house was massive, filled with artwork that probably cost more than most people's homes. The guests were all wealthy and powerful, the kind of people Jake had only seen in magazines before. But what bothered him most was how Catherine behaved around these people. She was charming and sophisticated, but there was something calculating about every conversation she had. Jake watched her manipulate discussions, gather information, and make subtle threats disguised as friendly suggestions. After the party, Catherine asked Jake to stay behind to help clean up. But instead of cleaning, she poured herself a glass of expensive wine and sat down across from him in her living room. "You did very well tonight," she said, studying him. "Carefully, you're learning to be exactly what I need." There was something in her voice that made Jake's skin crawl. "I'm just trying to do a good job," he replied. Catherine smiled, but it didn't look friendly. "I know you are, and I appreciate that, but I think it's time we discussed some additional responsibilities." Jake felt his stomach drop. "What kind of additional responsibilities?" "Nothing too demanding," Catherine said, taking a sip of her wine. "I sometimes need someone to handle more personal matters, things that require absolute trust and discretion." She pulled out a tablet and showed Jake several documents. They were contracts and agreements with other people, all of them similar to what Jake had signed. He realized with growing horror that he wasn't Catherine's only assistant. "These are some of my other associates," Catherine explained casually. "People who, like you, found themselves in difficult situations and were grateful for my help." Jake counted at least 6 different contracts. "How many people work for you like this?" "That's not really your concern," Catherine replied, her voice becoming slightly colder. "What matters is that each of these people understood that working for me requires complete loyalty, just like you do." Over the following days, Jake's assignments became increasingly strange. Catherine had him research personal information about people she was meeting with. She asked him to be present during phone calls that seemed more like threats than business negotiations. She even had him deliver envelopes to people who looked terrified when they saw him coming. The worst part was how Catherine constantly reminded him of his debt. She would bring it up casually in conversation, mentioning how much money he owed and how difficult his life would be if she decided to pursue legal action instead of their current arrangement. "You know, Jake," she said one afternoon while he was organizing her files, "I've been very generous with you. Most people in your situation wouldn't receive such favorable terms." Jake looked up from his work. "I'm grateful for the opportunity," he said, though the words felt hollow. "I hope you are," Catherine continued, "because trust is so important in relationships like ours. I need to know that you'll do whatever is necessary to maintain that trust." The phone calls started coming. At all hours after that, Catherine would wake him up at 2 in the morning because she needed him to drive across town and pick up a package from someone's house. She would interrupt his weekends because she suddenly needed him to attend a meeting where he was supposed to just sit quietly and listen. Jake's friends and family began asking questions about his new job. He wanted to tell them what was happening, but the confidentiality agreement he had signed was very clear about the consequences of discussing his work with anyone. More importantly, Jake was starting to understand that Catherine's help came with strings attached that went far beyond a simple employment relationship. The debt she held over him wasn't just financial anymore. She was collecting information about his life, his relationships, his weaknesses. One night, after a particularly long day that had stretched from morning until nearly midnight, Jake sat in his apartment and tried to figure out how he had gotten into this situation. The money was still good, and his bills were paid, but he felt like he was losing pieces of himself every day. Catherine's latest request had been the most troubling yet. She wanted him to befriend someone who owed her money and report back on their daily activities. It felt like spying, and Jake wasn't sure he was comfortable with that level of involvement in whatever Catherine was really doing. But every time he considered quitting, he remembered the debt hanging over his head and the legal threats Catherine had made so casually during their first meeting. He was trapped in a situation that seemed to get more complicated every day. Jake realized that satisfying Catherine's demands wasn't leading to the freedom she had promised. Instead, each task seemed to bind him more tightly to her world of manipulation and control. The mercy she had offered was starting to feel more like a carefully designed cage. As he fell asleep that night, Jake wondered if the price of Catherine's help was going to be higher than he could afford to pay. But by then he was already in too deep to find an easy way out. 6 months into working for Catherine, Jake started noticing something was wrong. The woman who had always seemed so confident and in control was beginning to crack. It started with small things, phone calls that made her pace around the office, meetings that ended with her slamming doors, and late nights where she would sit in her chair staring out the window with a worried expression. At first, Jake thought maybe she was just having a bad week. Everyone has those. But as days turned into weeks, Catherine's behavior became more erratic. She would snap at him over minor mistakes, then apologize immediately after. She started checking her phone constantly, as if waiting for bad news. One morning, Jake arrived at the office to find Catherine frantically shredding documents. Boxes of papers were scattered around her desk, and she was feeding page after page into the industrial shredder in the corner of her office. "Jake, perfect timing," she said, without looking up. "I need you to help me with this. These old files are taking up too much space." But Jake could see sweat on Catherine's forehead despite the air conditioning, and her hands were shaking slightly as she worked. This wasn't spring cleaning. This was someone destroying evidence. "What kind of files are these?" Jake asked carefully. Catherine paused for just a moment. "Just old business records, nothing important." Jake had been working for Catherine long enough to know when she was lying. These documents were definitely important, or she wouldn't be in such a rush to get rid of them. Over the next few days, Jake started piecing together what was happening. Catherine's phone calls became more frequent and more heated. She would speak in hushed tones, but Jake could hear words like investigation and subpoena and lawyers. Then the news broke. Jake was watching television at home when he saw Catherine's company mentioned in a breaking news report. The reporter was talking about a federal investigation into business practices that sounded exactly like what Jake had witnessed during his time working for her. The next morning, Catherine looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her usually perfect appearance was disheveled, and she kept checking the locks on her office door as if she expected someone to burst in at any moment. "Jake," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to ask you for a favor, a big favor." Jake felt his stomach drop. "What kind of favor?" Catherine pulled out a legal document and placed it on the desk between them. "The investigators are going to want to talk to people who work for me. If they ask you about our arrangement, I need you to say that you were just a regular administrative assistant." Jake stared at the paper. It looked like some kind of sworn statement, but that's not true. "It doesn't matter what's true," Catherine said, her voice becoming sharp with desperation. "What matters is protecting both of us. If you tell them about the other things you've done for me, they'll consider you an accomplice." The word accomplice hit Jake like a punch to the stomach. He had been so focused on paying off his debt and keeping his job that he hadn't really considered the legal implications of what Catherine had been asking him to do. "I never broke any laws," Jake said, though even as he said it, he wasn't entirely sure that was true. Catherine leaned forward. "Maybe not directly, but think about all those packages you delivered, all those meetings you attended, all the information you gathered for me. Do you really think the investigators will see it that way?" Jake realized with growing horror that Catherine was right. He had been so desperate to keep his job and pay off his debt that he had ignored all the warning signs. Now he was potentially in legal trouble because of her business practices, but what really shocked him was what Catherine said next. "I'm prepared to offer you a substantial bonus if you're willing to help me through this difficult time," she said. "And of course, I would be very grateful for your loyalty." It was the same tone she had used when they first met, when she had offered to help him with his debt. But now Jake could hear the desperation underneath the smooth words. Catherine needed him more than he needed her, and they both knew it. For the first time since he had started working for Catherine, Jake felt like he had some power in their relationship. It was a strange feeling, and he wasn't sure what to do with it. "I need to think about this," Jake said finally. Catherine's face went pale. "There isn't much time to think. The investigators could contact you any day now. Jake looked at the woman who had controlled his life for the past 6 months. She was still wealthy, still powerful, but for the first time, she was also vulnerable. The tables were starting to turn, and Catherine was beginning to understand what it felt like to need mercy from someone else. "I'll let you know tomorrow," Jake said, and walked out of the office, leaving Catherine alone with her fears and her rapidly crumbling empire. The federal agents arrived at Jake's apartment on a Thursday morning. Jake had been expecting them ever since his conversation with Catherine, but it was still jarring to open his door and see two serious-looking people in dark suits holding badges. "Jake Thompson?" the older agent asked. "We're with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We'd like to ask you some questions about your employer, Catherine Wells." Jake's heart was pounding, but he invited them in. They sat at his small kitchen table, and Jake tried to appear calm while his mind raced through everything he had done over the past 6 months. "We understand you work as Ms. Wells' personal assistant," the younger agent said, pulling out a notebook. "Can you tell us about your job responsibilities?" This was the moment Catherine had been preparing him for. She had given him a script to follow, a story that would minimize both their involvement in anything questionable. But sitting across from these agents, Jake realized he had a choice to make. He could lie to protect Catherine and hope that would protect himself, or he could tell the truth and hope the agents would understand that he had been manipulated into participating in things he didn't fully understand. "It's complicated," Jake said finally. The agents exchanged glances. "How so?" Jake took a deep breath and decided to tell them everything. He started with losing his job, explained about the debt Catherine claimed he owed, and described how his role had gradually expanded from basic administrative work to much more questionable activities. As he talked, Jake watched the agents' expressions change from professional interest to something that looked almost like sympathy. They asked detailed questions about specific incidents, took notes about the documents Catherine had asked him to destroy, and seemed particularly interested in the other assistants Catherine had mentioned. "Mr. Thompson," the older agent said, when Jake finished his story, "it sounds like you may have been a victim here as much as anyone else." Jake felt a wave of relief, but it was quickly followed by anxiety. "What happens now?" "That depends partly on you," the younger agent replied. "We're going to need your cooperation if we want to build a strong case against Ms. Wells. Are you willing to help us?" Before Jake could answer, his phone rang. It was Catherine. "Don't answer that," the older agent said quickly. "But from now on, I want you to record any conversations you have with her." Over the next few days, Jake found himself in the strange position of continuing to work for Catherine while secretly cooperating with the investigation against her. The agents had given him specific instructions about what information to gather and what questions to ask. Catherine seemed to sense that something had changed. She watched Jake more carefully now, and her requests became increasingly desperate. She asked him to contact people who owed her money and warn them about the investigation. She wanted him to retrieve files from a storage unit across town. She even suggested he might want to take a vacation until things settled down. But the most revealing moment came when Catherine broke down completely. Jake was in her office late one evening when she suddenly started crying. "I never meant for it to go this far," she said through her tears. "I started with small favors, just helping people who needed money. But then it became bigger, and I couldn't stop." Jake felt sorry for her despite everything she had put him through. "Catherine, maybe if you cooperate with the investigators." "You don't understand," she interrupted. "These people I was working with, they don't forgive mistakes. If I cooperate with the FBI, I'm not just looking at prison time, I'm looking at something much worse." It was the first time Catherine had admitted to Jake that her business involved people who might be dangerous. He realized that his own safety might be at risk simply because of what he knew. The next morning, Catherine made him an offer that showed just how desperate she had become. "I have money in overseas accounts," she told him. "Money the investigators don't know about. If you help me get out of the country, I'll give you enough to disappear too. We could both start over somewhere else." Jake stared at her in disbelief. "You're asking me to help you flee the country?" "I'm asking you to save both our lives," Catherine replied. "Because if I go down, they're going to try to take you with me." It was a threat disguised as an offer, but Jake could see through it. Now, Catherine was trying to manipulate him one last time, using his fear to get what she wanted. But Jake had learned something important over the past few months. Power wasn't permanent. People who seemed untouchable could fall just as quickly as they had risen. And sometimes, the mercy someone desperately needed came from the very people they had wronged. Jake looked at Catherine, this woman who had controlled his life for months, and realized that she was now completely at his mercy. Everything depended on what he decided to do next. The courtroom was packed on the day of Catherine's sentencing. Jake sat in the back, watching the woman who had once controlled his life now standing before a judge, waiting to learn her fate. She looked smaller somehow, less intimidating than she had in her penthouse office. The past year had been a whirlwind for Jake. After deciding to fully cooperate with the federal investigation, he had spent months giving testimony, providing evidence, and helping investigators understand the scope of Catherine's operations. It had been stressful and frightening, but it had also been liberating. The investigators had been true to their word. Instead of treating Jake as a criminal, they had recognized him as a victim who had been manipulated into participating in activities he didn't fully understand. He had been granted immunity in exchange for his cooperation, which meant he wouldn't face any criminal charges. But the emotional impact of everything he had experienced was harder to resolve than the legal issues. Jake had spent months in therapy, trying to understand how he had allowed himself to become so dependent on someone who was clearly manipulating him. His therapist helped him see that desperation can make people vulnerable to exploitation, that recognizing manipulation doesn't make someone weak or stupid. The trial had revealed the full extent of Catherine's business empire. She had been running what prosecutors called a debt trap scheme, where she would create or purchase debts that people couldn't pay, then offer them jobs that gradually drew them into increasingly questionable activities. Jake learned that there had been more than 20 people in situations similar to his own. Some of Catherine's assistants had refused to cooperate with investigators and were facing criminal charges themselves. Others, like Jake, had been willing to testify about their experiences and had received immunity. A few had simply disappeared, possibly fleeing the country to avoid prosecution. During his testimony, Jake had tried to be fair but honest. He described the manipulation and threats Catherine had used, but he also acknowledged that she had paid him well and had never directly forced him to do anything illegal. He wanted the court to understand the psychological pressure he had been under, but he didn't want to exaggerate or make himself sound more victimized than he actually was. The hardest part had been testifying about the personal aspects of his relationship with Catherine. The prosecutors needed to establish that she had used psychological manipulation to control her employees, but Jake felt uncomfortable discussing the more intimate details of how she had gradually broken down his boundaries and made him dependent on her approval. When it came time for Catherine's sentencing, Jake found himself in a position he had never expected. The judge asked if any of the victims wanted to make a statement before sentencing. Several people stood up to describe how Catherine had destroyed their lives and demanded that she receive the maximum possible sentence. But when it was Jake's turn to speak, he surprised everyone, including himself. "Your Honor," he said, standing up slowly, "I want to say that what Catherine did was wrong, and I think she should face consequences for her actions. But I also want to say that she's not a monster. She's a person who made bad choices and hurt people, but she's still a person." Jake could feel Catherine's eyes on him as he spoke. "I think she needs to go to prison, but I also think she needs help, and I hope that when she gets out, she use her intelligence and her resources to help people instead of hurting them." It wasn't the angry, vengeful statement many people expected. Instead, it was a measured response that acknowledged both the harm Catherine had caused and her potential for change. The judge sentenced Catherine to 8 years in federal prison, along with substantial fines and restitution payments to her victims. It was a significant sentence, but not the maximum she could have received. After the sentencing, Jake ran into Catherine's lawyer in the courthouse hallway. The lawyer told him that Catherine had specifically asked him to thank Jake for his statement, and that it had probably influenced the judge's decision to sentence her at the lower end of the guidelines. 6 months later, Jake received a letter from Catherine in prison. It was the first contact they had had since the investigation began. In the letter, Catherine apologized for putting him in such a difficult position and acknowledged that she had manipulated and used him. She also thanked him for showing restraint during his testimony and said she understood that he could have been much harsher if he had wanted to be. Jake read the letter several times before deciding how to respond. Part of him wanted to ignore it completely. Part of him wanted to write back and tell Catherine exactly how much damage she had done to his life and the lives of others. But in the end, Jake decided not to respond at all. Not because he was angry, but because he realized that their relationship was finally over. Catherine no longer had any power over him, and he no longer needed anything from her, not even an apology. Jake kept the letter though. It served as a reminder of how quickly situations can change, how people who seem powerful can become vulnerable, and how the mercy we show others often says more about us than about them. 2 years after Catherine's sentencing, Jake had rebuilt his life completely. He had found a good job with a company that valued his experience and treated him fairly. He had started dating someone who respected his boundaries and understood his past. He had even started volunteering with an organization that helped people facing financial crises, using his experience to help others avoid the kind of trap he had fallen into. Sometimes people asked Jake if he regretted not being harsher in his testimony against Catherine. They wondered if he should have demanded the maximum sentence or refused to acknowledge any positive aspects of their relationship. But Jake had learned that mercy isn't about forgetting what someone did wrong. It's about choosing not to let their mistakes define either them or yourself. Catherine had made choices that hurt people, and she had paid a price for those choices. Jake had made choices too, and ultimately, those choices had led him to a better place. The story ended not with revenge or perfect justice, but with the understanding that human relationships are complicated, that people can change, and that sometimes the greatest strength comes from choosing compassion over anger, even when anger would be justified. Jake never saw Catherine again after her release from prison, but he heard through mutual contacts that she had started a non-profit organization that helped people with financial literacy and debt management. He hoped it was true, and he hoped she was using her second chance to help people instead of exploiting them. In the end, the mercy Jake had shown Catherine had been as much about freeing himself as it had been about helping her. By choosing not to seek revenge, he had avoided becoming bitter and angry. By acknowledging her humanity even after she had hurt him, he had preserved his own ability to trust and care about others. The experience had taught Jake that power is temporary, that desperation can make anyone vulnerable, and that the mercy we give to others is often the mercy we need most ourselves.